A fire, fierce and unforgiving, tore through an apartment complex, leaving behind devastation and a loss that seemed impossible to understand. The victim, Rico Summers, was found dead inside his own home. On the surface, it appeared to be a tragic accident, an electrical malfunction, perhaps. Yet, the investigation that followed would reveal a darker truth. This fire was no accident. It was carefully planned, a deliberate act that sought to mimic the look of a faulty electrical system. But in reality, it was far more sinister. Rico's death seemed like a random tragedy, a life lost in the blink of an eye. But as fire marshals dug deeper into the scene, it became clear that this blaze was intentionally set. What appeared to be a simple tragedy unraveled into a complex web of evidence, pointing toward a calculated act of revenge. The blaze, the forced entry, the accelerants, it all began to fall into place. Every detail was deliberately staged to look like an accident, but someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it wasn't. The case didn't end with the flames. It only began. What seemed like a senseless tragedy was in fact an orchestrated plot with one goal: silencing a man. And as investigators pieced together the puzzle, a chilling question lingered. Who was behind this twisted crime? And why was Rico, a man with no apparent enemies, targeted in such a horrific way? This case would not only test the skill and determination of investigators, but would also force everyone to reconsider the true nature of fire-related deaths. Could it be that fire, often seen as the most accidental of killers, was in this case a weapon of choice, a weapon used with intent and precision? As the investigation continued, each new revelation pointed to something darker, something much more calculated than anyone had imagined. Rico Summers was a man of few words. In his mid-30s, he lived a life that seemed uneventful to those around him, a quiet tenant in an ordinary apartment complex. His routine was simple, his world confined mostly to his job and his small circle of friends. He wasn't someone who drew attention, nor was he known for being involved in any dramatic incidents. Yet behind this unassuming exterior, Rico was carrying a growing burden. For weeks leading up to his death, Rico had been in the midst of a personal struggle with his former roommate, a man who had once been a close friend. What began as a shared living situation turned sour, as tensions between them began to rise. The argument that eventually culminated in the restraining order was not an isolated event, but rather the final straw in a series of threats and escalating disputes. Rico's decision to file the order was a clear sign of his desperation, his attempt to reclaim his life from the grip of someone who had become dangerous. The restraining order, filed just days before the fatal fire, would prove to be a pivotal moment in this story. It was a legal document that symbolized more than just a formal boundary. It represented Rico's realization that the person he once trusted had become an enemy. The former roommate, whom Rico had once welcomed into his home, now loomed over his life like a dark shadow. The emotional toll of the situation was palpable, and the fear Rico must have felt is difficult to imagine. Rico's quiet nature, his desire for peace and stability, made it all the more tragic that he found himself in such a volatile situation. For many who knew him, his death was not just a loss, but a bewildering one. How could someone so seemingly ordinary, so removed from the chaos of the world, become the target of such violence? The answer would lie in the careful investigation that was just beginning to unfold. As we explore this case further, it's important to understand the complex forces at play behind Rico's death. What might seem like a simple tragedy is, in fact, the result of deep-rooted tension, betrayal, and calculated violence. Stay with us as we delve into the investigation that will uncover the chilling details of this crime. If you're as intrigued by the twists and turns of this case as we are, be sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. We dive deep into the complexities of real-life criminal investigations, bringing you stories that are as gripping as they are revealing. Don't miss out on our next episode, where we explore the dynamics that led to this tragic event and the relationships that ultimately resulted in Rico's untimely death. At the heart of the case lay a relationship that, on the surface, appeared to be little more than a simple cohabitation between two roommates. But as investigators delved deeper into the background of Rico Summers and his former roommate, it became clear that this was no ordinary living arrangement. This was a volatile, complex relationship marked by manipulation, growing resentment, and, ultimately, betrayal. Rico's former roommate, once considered a close friend, had moved in with him under the pretense of sharing living costs and companionship. In the early days of their cohabitation, there was little indication that anything would go wrong. Rico, a reserved and somewhat introverted individual, was drawn to people who were more outgoing, perhaps in an attempt to balance his own quieter nature. His former roommate seemed to fit the mold, charismatic, assertive, and easy to get along with. However, as time passed, cracks began to form in the foundation of their friendship. Rico's roommate had a darker side, one that was not immediately apparent to those outside their shared apartment. Over time, he began exhibiting behaviors that suggested an underlying instability. Small arguments turned into larger disputes, with Rico often taking the brunt of the blame. His former roommate began to manipulate situations to his advantage, turning even minor disagreements into battles for control. There were accusations, both implicit and explicit, that Rico was not living up to expectations. What started as casual friction soon morphed into something more toxic. But it wasn't until Rico began seeking outside help that the full extent of the dynamics between them became evident. A few months before the fire, Rico sought advice from friends and professionals about his living situation. It was then that he learned how much his former roommate had begun to dominate his life, not just in their shared apartment, but in nearly every aspect of his day-to-day existence. The tension reached a boiling point when Rico's former roommate began using emotional manipulation to keep him from seeking independence. Subtle threats, veiled in the guise of concern, began to take their toll on Rico's mental state. Rico, unwilling to confront the situation head-on, began to withdraw. His natural inclination to avoid conflict left him feeling trapped. The roommate, sensing Rico's growing discomfort, escalated his behavior, becoming more possessive, increasingly aggressive, and ultimately violent. The power dynamic that had once been based on mutual respect had slowly tipped in favor of the roommate, who now had a stranglehold on Rico's life. What the public did not know was that the former roommate was no stranger to conflict. His history, unbeknownst to Rico, was filled with violent tendencies and unresolved personal issues. Those who had crossed him in the past were often left bewildered by his sudden outbursts and manipulative behavior. But no one could have predicted how far he would go in his pursuit of dominance over Rico. The culmination of this toxic relationship came when Rico, in a desperate attempt to break free, filed a restraining order against his former roommate. This was not a decision Rico made lightly. In fact, it was one of the hardest things he had ever done. The roommate, who had been a constant presence in his life, was now the person Rico feared most. The restraining order was a cry for help, a legal attempt to sever the grip his former roommate had on him. It was an acknowledgement that things had gone too far, that Rico was no longer safe. But as investigators would soon discover, filing the restraining order may have been a fatal decision. The roommate, embittered by this public declaration of fear, reacted with increasing hostility. The manipulation that had once been subtle grew more intense, leading to an ultimate act of violence that would forever alter both of their lives. The emotional toll on Rico was immense. The internal conflict he must have faced, torn between his natural desire to avoid confrontation and his desperate need for safety, weighed heavily on him. Those close to him observed a marked change in his demeanor in the weeks leading up to the fire. He seemed more withdrawn, more anxious, as though he were constantly looking over his shoulder. The once mild-mannered man, who had preferred to keep to himself, had become a shell of his former self, burdened by the toxic relationship that threatened to consume him. As for the former roommate, his actions revealed the darker, more sinister side to his personality. His deep-seated anger and the way he manipulated others around him made it clear that his relationship with Rico was merely a stepping stone in a long history of controlling and dominating those in his life. His willingness to go to such extreme lengths to force his way into Rico's home and stage a fire showed just how far he was willing to go to exact revenge. But it wasn't just about revenge. It was about power, control, and making Rico suffer for attempting to break free. This was not simply a case of a falling out between roommates. It was a story of emotional abuse, manipulation, and an escalating power struggle that led to one man's tragic death. Rico's life was torn apart by the very person he had once trusted, and the consequences of that betrayal would be far-reaching, both for the victim and the perpetrator. In the days leading up to the fatal fire, the tension between Rico Summers and his former roommate had reached a boiling point. While no one could have predicted the horror that would unfold, there were early signs of trouble. Subtle, yet alarming. These signs were not merely the result of an isolated argument, but rather the culmination of months of escalating behavior, manipulation, and emotional warfare. The most glaring early warning sign came when Rico decided to take the step of filing a restraining order. For many, this action might seem like the result of an isolated incident, just one more argument or one more push. But for Rico, it was a critical moment of recognition. He was acknowledging that his relationship with his former roommate had gone beyond the point of repair, and that he was no longer safe. This legal measure, meant to protect him from further harm, was not just about setting boundaries. It was a cry for help, a desperate attempt to regain control of his life. But this was also a dangerous move. By filing the restraining order, Rico had forced his former roommate into a corner. In the world of abusers and manipulators, this act of defiance is often seen as an affront, an assertion of power that must be crushed. For someone like Rico's former roommate, who had grown accustomed to dominating his environment, this was a challenge that could not be overlooked. As soon as the restraining order was filed, the dynamics shifted irreparably. What had been a growing sense of tension now turned into something far more volatile. Before this moment, there had been other signs, more subtle but equally significant. Rico had begun to withdraw. He had stopped spending time with the people who had once been a source of comfort to him. He grew quieter, more anxious. His once routine activities, running errands, going to work, were increasingly overshadowed by the fear that something terrible was about to happen. It's difficult to say just how much of this fear was rational or induced by his manipulative roommate, but those close to him noticed the change. The former roommate, too, began to show signs of escalating behavior. It wasn't just the verbal confrontations or the emotional manipulation anymore. The threats, once veiled in indirect language, had become more direct. People who witnessed the interactions between the two roommates noticed the former roommate's increasing aggression, especially in public settings. His behavior was no longer just controlling. It was erratic, unpredictable, and threatening. Rico's attempts to address the situation by filing the restraining order were seen as a last resort. He was running out of options. His efforts to avoid conflict, to preserve the peace at any cost, had not worked. The former roommate's hold over him was tightening. Still, even with the legal protection now in place, the emotional and psychological toll on Rico was mounting. His safety, once his primary concern, was now compounded by feelings of shame, helplessness, and regret. The very act of filing the restraining order meant to protect him may have inadvertently painted a target on his back. Rico's internal battle was compounded by the external one with his former roommate. As Rico pulled away, the roommate's desperation to regain control grew. It wasn't just about the loss of a living arrangement or a former friend. It was about maintaining the upper hand, about not being exposed. And so, when the restraining order went into effect, the former roommate's response was chilling. The manipulation shifted from emotional games to direct confrontation, laying the groundwork for the violence that would soon follow. In the days after the restraining order was filed, the situation became even more fraught. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices, the unmistakable tension in the air, but no one knew how dangerous the situation had become. The true depth of the former roommate's rage, how deeply it had festered, was not yet fully understood by those around them. Rico's actions had triggered something primal in his former roommate, a need for control that would stop at nothing. As the investigation would later reveal, it wasn't just the fear of being confronted or humiliated. It was a desire for revenge. The fire, which would take Rico's life, was not an impulsive act. It was the tragic end to a long sequence of manipulative behavior and calculated escalation. As the authorities would soon discover, the path that led to the fire was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of weeks, if not months, of warning signs that were tragically ignored. From Rico's mounting fear to his former roommate's increasingly erratic behavior, every detail now pointed to a crime of calculated rage. The fire was not just the end of a life. It was the horrifying manifestation of everything that had been building between the two men for far too long. The night of the fire that would take Rico Summers' life was not a random act of violence. It was the inevitable result of a deeply troubling and calculated escalation. The stage had been set in the weeks leading up to the fatal night, Rico's attempts to protect himself, the mounting tension between him and his former roommate, and the rising desperation of a man whose hold on power was slipping. By the time the fire was ignited, it was no longer about settling a dispute. It was about revenge. Revenge that would go to any lengths to ensure that Rico never had the chance to break free. The deliberate nature of the crime became evident from the outset. The fire, which had initially appeared to be caused by an electrical malfunction, was later determined to have been set using a dual-ignition accelerant pattern. This was not a quick or impulsive decision. It was an orchestrated move to stage the scene in such a way that would mislead investigators. The accelerants used mimicked the telltale signs of an electrical fault, a clever trick designed to throw off any suspicion and create the illusion of an accident. But this was far from a chance occurrence. Rico's former roommate had taken every precaution to ensure the fire would appear accidental. A deep understanding of fire behavior, perhaps learned from past experiences or a twisted intuition, allowed him to stage the scene with terrifying precision. The dual-ignition accelerant pattern was an expert move, ensuring that investigators would initially focus on the possibility of faulty wiring. It was a calculated step aimed at shifting the narrative and allowing the former roommate to avoid suspicion. In reality, this was not the result of an electrical issue at all, but the outcome of a sinister plot that had been carefully constructed. It wasn't just the accelerants that pointed to foul play. A crucial piece of evidence lay in the doorframe of Rico's apartment. Forensics experts later confirmed that there were tool marks on the doorframe indicating forced entry. But the chilling detail was that the forced entry occurred after Rico had already lost consciousness. This meant that the fire had been set while Rico was still alive, but already incapacitated. The forced entry was not a sign of a break-in, but an attempt to make the scene appear as though Rico had been caught off guard, an effort to add another layer of confusion to the investigation. The use of fire as a weapon was not just about destruction. It was a deliberate attempt to cover up the crime. The former roommate understood the power of fire. It erased evidence, it obliterated traces, and it allowed a murderer to hide in plain sight. The fire wasn't just a tool of destruction. It was a tool of manipulation. It destroyed not only Rico's life, but also the possibility of uncovering the truth. When investigators arrived at the scene, the chaos was immediate. First responders struggled to contain the blaze, but the damage was already done. The apartment had been completely consumed by flames. Yet, as the fire began to subside and the forensics teams moved in, it became clear that the fire was not an accident. Investigators quickly noted the inconsistencies, the pattern of the fire, the forced entry, and the fact that Rico's body was found far from where he would have been expected to be had he been asleep when the fire started. The nature of the crime was beginning to reveal itself. Rico had been caught in a trap. His attempt to protect himself, his decision to file the restraining order, had unwittingly made him more vulnerable. The former roommate, enraged by the perceived betrayal, had gone to extreme lengths to ensure that Rico would not survive. The fire was an act of violence wrapped in a cloak of deception, designed to make it look like a tragic accident. But the signs were there, and the investigators were beginning to see them. As they sifted through the charred remnants of the apartment, every detail became more telling. It was clear that this was no random act of arson. This was a cold, premeditated act of violence, driven by the need for control and the desire to punish. Rico's death was not just an unfortunate consequence of living with an unstable roommate. It was the result of a carefully planned act of retribution. The fire was not simply an end to a life. It was the end of the former roommate's twisted attempt to dominate and control Rico. The deliberate nature of the crime sent shockwaves through the investigation. The fact that the fire had been staged so expertly meant that the authorities would have to dig deeper, analyze every piece of evidence, and uncover the layers of deception that had been carefully constructed. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, one thing became clear. This was no ordinary case of arson. This was a murder. The aftermath of the fire was a chaotic and heart-wrenching scene. As fire engines and police vehicles lined the street, the full scope of the devastation became evident. Neighbors gathered outside, eyes wide with disbelief as they watched the firefighters work tirelessly to contain the flames. Inside the building, Rico Summers' life had been violently extinguished, and the scene was one of utter destruction. Yet, even amidst the physical ruin, the emotional toll was palpable, especially for those who had known him best. For Rico's family, the news of his death was a devastating shock. His parents, who had never expected their son to be caught in a situation so tragic, were left grappling with confusion and grief. They could hardly believe that their quiet, introverted son, who had kept to himself for so long, had become the target of such an intense, deliberate act of violence. In the days following the fire, they struggled to make sense of the loss, piecing together the story of a man who had kept so much of his pain hidden from them. They hadn't known the full extent of the tension between Rico and his former roommate. They hadn't known the depth of his fear, nor had they fully understood the danger he had been living in. For friends and coworkers, the shock was just as profound. Rico had been a reserved person, but those who knew him well described him as kind-hearted and dependable. His colleagues at work expressed disbelief that someone so seemingly harmless had been the victim of such a brutal crime. They recalled small things, like his tendency to keep to himself or the occasional mention of difficulties with his living situation. But none of these clues seemed to add up to the tragedy that would eventually unfold. Those who had spent time with him began to wonder if they had missed warning signs, signs that might have helped them intervene or offer support. But hindsight, as they say, is always clearer than the present. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, there was a sense of unease in the neighborhood. People whispered in hushed tones, sharing what little they knew of Rico's life and trying to make sense of his violent end. It was clear to many that this wasn't the result of a random tragedy, but a personal attack. But who could have done this? And why? The unanswered questions only amplified the growing tension in the community. The police investigation began promptly, but the scene was not an easy one to navigate. The fire, though largely contained, had destroyed much of the physical evidence. What remained of the apartment was little more than a charred shell, and the signs of forced entry into the apartment were all that stood out in the aftermath. Forensics teams worked meticulously, sifting through the rubble to uncover any clues that might point to the cause of the fire and the identity of the perpetrator. As the investigation continued, the emotional responses from those close to Rico only deepened. Family members were left to deal with not just their grief, but also the uncertainty of the circumstances surrounding his death. They were determined to know what had happened to him, Yet the more they learned, the more horrifying the reality became. Rico's attempt to protect himself, his decision to file a restraining order, seemed to have set off a tragic chain of events. What had started as a call for help had escalated into something far more lethal. For the police, the immediate challenge was to connect the dots between the evidence they had, primarily the forced entry and the odd nature of the fire, and the growing suspicion of foul play. The forced entry into the apartment suggested that Rico had been the victim of a targeted attack, not a random break-in. But who would have wanted to harm him so violently? The answer, though not yet clear, was beginning to take shape. As the investigators turned their attention to the people closest to Rico, they began to unravel the details of the relationship with his former roommate, a connection that would soon prove to be the key to solving the case. The community, still reeling from the shock, began to question how something so horrific could have happened in their own neighborhood. They were left to wonder whether the quiet man who lived among them had been hiding the depths of his fear from them all along. Could anyone have known what was happening behind closed doors? Or was Rico simply another victim of a world that can sometimes be far darker than we can imagine? In the days following the fire, investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the truth behind Rico Summers' death. What had seemed like a tragic, yet random accident was slowly beginning to reveal itself as something far more sinister. With every piece of evidence they uncovered, the reality of what had happened to Rico became clearer and more chilling. The first crucial breakthrough came in the form of forensic analysis. Fire marshals, having initially suspected an electrical fault, quickly shifted their focus when the pattern of the blaze was revealed to be anything but accidental. Experts determined that the fire had been set using a dual-ignition accelerant pattern, an intentional act designed to mimic the effect of a faulty electrical system. This was no random blaze. It had been strategically staged to confuse investigators and conceal the true cause of death. The accelerant used was a chemical compound that burned with a distinct and unusual signature. It wasn't long before investigators sent a sample of the residue found at the scene to a specialized lab. The results were eye-opening. The chemical signature of the accelerant matched one that could be traced back to a specific source. It was a common industrial substance, available to those with knowledge of its properties, and it suggested a level of premeditation that was difficult to ignore. The idea that this had been an accident was now impossible to defend. The next piece of the puzzle came from the analysis of the physical evidence at the scene. Forensic investigators carefully examined the doorframe, and what they found left little doubt that this was not a burglary gone wrong. Tool marks on the doorframe indicated forced entry, but crucially, the marks suggested that the entry had occurred after Rico was already unconscious. This revealed that Rico had not been awake when the fire started. The fire had been set while he was incapacitated, which meant that the person responsible had ensured he was subdued before taking the deadly step of igniting the blaze. This detail was pivotal. It suggested that this was not a crime of opportunity, but a crime of intent. As investigators dug deeper, it became clear that the forced entry was a calculated part of the crime scene. The perpetrator had entered the apartment after Rico had already been knocked unconscious, further supporting the theory that this was a targeted attack. The fire, which had initially been thought to be the focal point of the crime, was now revealed to be a means of covering up the true nature of what had happened. The murderer had made sure to manipulate the scene in a way that would mislead anyone looking into the case. It was around this time that the police began to piece together the connection between Rico and his former roommate. Initially, the roommate had seemed like a distant figure in the investigation, someone who was unlikely to have played a role in such a heinous act. However, as detectives looked into the details of their relationship, a more disturbing picture began to emerge. The former roommate had a history, one that was hidden beneath layers of manipulation and deceit. Rico's decision to file the restraining order, which had seemed like a simple legal maneuver to protect himself, now took on a darker significance. The restraining order had been the catalyst for the violence, a line in the sand that Rico's former roommate could not tolerate. The emotional instability and mounting anger of the former roommate, combined with the intense need to regain control, had led to the tragic events that would unfold on the night of the fire. The final key to the investigation came when a trace analysis of soot found on the suspect's clothing revealed a startling match with the chemical signature of the accelerant used in the fire. This discovery was the smoking gun. The evidence was irrefutable. The former roommate had been directly involved in the crime. The soot analysis indicated that the suspect had been close to the fire when it was set, and his clothing carried traces of the same accelerant found at the scene. The forensic evidence now linked the former roommate to the crime in a way that left little room for doubt. With this revelation, the investigation shifted into high gear. The police had their suspect. They could now confidently connect the dots between the evidence at the scene and the individual responsible for Rico's death. The former roommate, whose life had been marked by emotional volatility and a pattern of control, was now the prime suspect in a murder case that would send shockwaves through the community. For Rico's family, the revelation brought a sense of tragic clarity. The man who had once been trusted in their home, the person Rico had lived with, had turned out to be his worst enemy. The betrayal was deep, and the realization that the person responsible for his death was someone so close to him made the loss all the more painful. As the investigation closed in on the suspect, the details of the crime painted a harrowing picture of a carefully orchestrated act of violence. The fire was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of revenge, staged with expert precision to cover up the true nature of the crime. With the suspect's identity now known, the investigation was entering its final phase, where justice would be pursued. But for those who knew Rico, the revelation was not just a piece of the puzzle. It was a painful reminder of the darkness that can sometimes lie hidden in the most unexpected places. The revelation of the truth behind Rico Summers' death was a bitter pill to swallow for everyone involved. For his family, the emotional consequences were immediate and devastating. The shock of learning that the person who had lived under their roof, trusted in their home, was the one who had taken their son's life, created an unbridgeable rift between the world they knew and the nightmare they were now forced to live. It was a brutal blow, one that left them not only mourning the loss of their loved one, but also grappling with the unimaginable betrayal. The fact that Rico's former roommate had turned from a trusted companion to a deadly adversary was a truth too painful to bear. For Rico's friends and co-workers, the aftermath was equally complex. They were left to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the victim of a heinous crime. In the days after the fire, they reflected on the quiet, introverted man they had once interacted with? Had there been signs they missed? Had they failed to notice the growing tension in his life? The questions haunted them, adding another layer of grief. The sadness of losing a friend was compounded by the guilt of not knowing what he had been going through in his final days. As the criminal justice process began to unfold, the former roommate was arrested and charged with murder. Yet, even as the law took its course, the emotional toll on everyone involved remained. The truth, though now out in the open, did little to ease the pain. Rico's death was a stark reminder of how quickly lives can be altered, how the smallest actions can set off a chain of events that spiral into tragedy. In the broader community, the impact of the crime resonated deeply. Neighbors, who had once viewed the pair as simply two men living together, now found themselves questioning the nature of the relationships they had with those around them. The deception and manipulation that had been hidden in plain sight led many to rethink their own connections, and the haunting realization that betrayal could occur so close to home lingered in the air. For those left behind, the crime served as a sobering reflection on the fragility of trust and the lengths to which some would go to hold onto power and control. It was a reminder of how unchecked aggression and emotional manipulation could evolve into something far more dangerous, something that could destroy lives. As we close this chapter, we encourage you, the viewers, to reflect on the lessons this case offers. What does this tragedy reveal about the ways in which toxic relationships can manifest in unexpected ways? What steps can we take to protect ourselves and others from becoming victims of manipulation and control? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know how this case has affected your perspective on relationships and personal safety. Don't forget to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence for more deep dives into real-life investigations that uncover the hidden truths behind the headlines.